So let me ask you something. Is the training program that you've designed making good progress? And how do you make decisions about programming if things are not moving in the right direction? If you're unsure, then it's possible that you're not tracking the right things in your programming. If you're new here, my name is Norman Chung, and I've been coaching powerlifting for over a decade. And since then, I've coached several athletes and university teams to the international stage. So, in this ultimate guide to powerlifting program monitoring, we will go through everything that you need to know about monitoring training programs and go through some useful metrics that you can use to track progress and maximize performance. So let's get started. Now, when it comes to monitoring your training program, there isn't one golden metric that tells you everything that you need to know about a training program. It's more like using a selection of metrics to help you paint a bigger picture of the training situation. A good analogy would be the parable of the blind men and the sixth elephant. And if you don't know the story, it's basically a story about 6 blind men who encounter an elephant for the first time. And each of the 6 blind men basically touch different parts of the animal. And each man feels a different part, such as the trunk, the leg, or the tail, and comes to his own conclusion about what the elephant is like. And then they argue amongst themselves, each insisting that his own perception of the elephant is the correct one. And the moral of the parable underscores the importance of considering multiple perspectives to get a more complete understanding of the whole. So tracking metrics in a program is very much like, so the analogy of this story is very much like tracking metrics in a program. Each metric can describe an aspect of the nature of the program and the training progress, but not say too much about another aspect. It's also useful to know that each coach has different opinions about what they like to monitor. As much as there isn't such a thing as keeping track of too much, but if you are trying to pay attention to too many things at the same time, it can create a lot of noise for you and stop you from being able to make good decisions. So why do we monitor training programs? Well, we monitor training programs simply because we need to turn data into information to help inform our decision making with training prescriptions with the oncoming weeks. By making the right observations, we can then make good decisions and then create progress and put ourselves in the best position to perform when it needs to matter. So obviously, in the context of a powerlifter, it would be preparing ourselves best for competition. So what do we need to monitor? In my opinion, there are 3 main categories of things that we need to monitor when programming. They are the state of performance, the state of fatigue, and the work done. So to understand these 3 aspects of training, we also need to understand the fitness fatigue model. This model basically shows us that when we impose a stimuli, there are 2 sets of physical processes that take place. They are the processes that lead to the fitness outcomes, as well as the inevitable processes that hinder our ability to express our fitness levels. These are the fatigue effects. And the sum of all of these effects lead to performance, which is what we could hypothetically do in real time. The state of performance in powerlifting can include our hypothetical maximal strength performance, but can include our work capacity as well. Metrics that represent our current state of performance can be represented in objective values. The state of fatigue isn't something objective that we measure, but we can measure its impact on performance and the relative change across time. And monitoring work done or training load is all about knowing what you did and what dose of training you imposed on yourself or on an athlete. So we can monitor information from a training program to help us build more certainty about our current theory of what we think is going on. But often, we never get absolute certainty, and what you need to do is go in with your best educated guess and program accordingly. So what's important to keep in mind when we are monitoring training? So we monitor information from a program to help us build more certainty about the current theory of what we think is going on. But sometimes we never get to absolute certainty. And so what you need to do is then go with your best educated guess and program accordingly. And if you're correct, the training response will happen in a way that you think it will happen. Another thing that is also worth monitoring is the athlete's subjective response to training stimulus. And this may not necessarily be a quantifiable experience, which is why powerlifting coaching isn't just programming. And if you are someone who is self-coached, it does take a lot of self-awareness to reflect upon your experiences and being honest with what you are perceiving. So what's the difference between tracking and monitoring? Well, one of the things I often talk about is the difference between tracking and monitoring. Tracking is about just keeping record, which is useful for potentially using at a much later point in the future. Monitoring is where your attention is at. So sometimes it's useful to track something, but not necessarily monitor it straight away. So do we track different things between athletes? Let's say novice versus trained individuals. Something that's also worth noting is that depending on the experience level of the athlete that you're programming for, you may monitor slightly different things. Especially when it comes to a novice athlete, one of the things that you may want to monitor a little bit more is stuff like the technique, their movement quality, which are more subjective qualitative aspects. Whereas when it comes to monitoring for a more experienced athlete, you may pay attention to more quantitative aspects of the programming. So let's go through some things that we can track to monitor the work done. So the first one is going to be total sets. Now, total sets metric refers to the number of sets performed for a specific exercise over a period of time. It can help evaluate the volume of training and complements the monitoring of total reps as well. Now, you may choose to track this for specific lifts or muscle groups. It may not necessarily be something that changes too much throughout a block of training, so you may track it but not necessarily pay too much attention to it short term. However, it may be something that you would want to analyze in programs if you are coaching a new lifter. And what can it tell us? Well, like total reps and tonnage metrics, total sets can help determine the training volume. A high number of sets typically indicates higher training volume, although intensity are also crucial factors as well. You can also get an idea of a workout structure. For example, more sets given for an exercise may show where you are biasing the stress and subsequently the adaptations more. So total sets doesn't provide any information about the weight lifted. You could perform many sets with light weights or fewer sets with heavy weights, leading to different adaptations. It also doesn't tell us about the effort or the level of fatigue experienced by the individual. You could also potentially keep the total number of reps the same, but spread the reps over more sets. So even though more sets have increased, the reps have not, which in this case means that the sets were probably easier. So this metric is a good tool for assessing workout volume, but lacks the ability to fully understand the training intensity. So I personally find it useful to look at total reps as well as total sets together to visualize the overall volume of a given training block. So the next metric is total reps. So total reps is often referred to as the number of lifts or total volume. So the total reps metric refers to the cumulative number of reps or lifts performed during a session or over a specific period. Just like total sets, you can also track it for individual lifts or even across muscle groups as well. It's a simple yet useful metric to gauge the volume of work done, but doesn't account for the weight lifted, obviously. So total reps can be used to compare different training sessions or assess progression over time, especially when a weight lifted remains consistent. And by evaluating the total reps performed for different muscle groups or movements, you can assess where the focus is or where the stress is. So total reps obviously doesn't consider the weight lifted, so they don't provide an insight into the intensity. So two training sessions with the same total reps for a given movement can differ significantly in intensity or RPE. And the third metric is going to be tonnage. Now, the tonnage metric is also sometimes referred to as volume, which can be a little bit confusing. So the tonnage metric in training refers to the total work done by multiplying the weight lifted by the number of reps and the sets performed. I think this is a great metric to use for looking at training short term. And the reason why it may not always be useful to look at tonnage long term is if you end up training with very different exercise variations, especially if they are load limiting variations. For example, if you're comparing a low bar back squat to a tempo paused high bar squat. So tonnage is a very useful metric for quantifying the total load lifted during the session, because any independent increase in sets, reps or load with everything else being kept consistent, increases in tonnage can indicate improvements in performance as well as progression in the stimulus as well. Depending on the context, spikes in tonnage can also be an indicator of injury risk as well. Although it is evidence of doing more, it doesn't necessarily tell you whether it's a forced progression or whether the increase in tonnage is the result of natural progressive overload. It also doesn't account for how hard a person is working and doesn't offer insights into the athlete's state of fatigue or recovery needs. So the fourth metric is going to be peak intensity. Now, peak intensity refers to the highest intensity of load lifted used in training sessions, training week or training block. It's a measure of the intensity that a lifter has been exposed to for a given exercise, often associated with the main three lifts. It can tell us the aspect of how much specificity exposure that we have across a period of training, and it's often associated with predicting your 1 rep max or your top end strength. Tracking the changes for a given peak intensity over time can help monitor improvements in our max strength. So estimating your 1 rep max based on your peak intensity is going to help us give us the most accurate prediction of your top end strength. And the higher the peak intensity, the more accurate that your estimated 1 rep max will be. For example, predicting your 1 rep max based on a 90% set is going to be more accurate than an 80% set. What peak intensity doesn't help us with is give indication of improvement in progress unless you actually track the load itself, which we will discuss next. It also gives no context on how hard it moved either, i.e. RPE or reps in reserve. So that's why it's also important to track those metrics as well. And so the next one is going to be peak load. Peak load in a program is simply the highest absolute load performed in training for a given exercise. It is similar to peak intensity, and sometimes the peak load will be performed at the peak intensity, but sometimes that may not be the case. For example, let's say you did a heavy single at RP7 this week, which was equivalent to, let's say, 90%, and you hit 200 kilos. The next week, you did a heavy single at RP8, which was equivalent to, say, about 93%. And let's say you did 195 kilos. The peak load was 200 kilos in week 1, but the peak intensity happened in the week 2, where you did a single at RPE, which was equivalent to 93%. By tracking peak load over time, you can monitor progress in strength, and increases in peak load can be a very motivating metric for the lifter to keep an eye on too. Lifters often use peak load as a benchmark for setting goals, especially when it comes to preparing for a competition. It can also give you a rough idea of what range of weight you could probably do for subsequent weeks too. On the other hand, just because you may lift a heavier weight does not necessarily mean that your performance has improved on that week. This is because your estimated top end may depend massively on how hard that weight actually was, relatively speaking. So having said that, peak load should be used in conjunction with RPE to help you figure out what your top end performance is. And moving on to the next one, average intensity. So average intensity refers to the average percentages of all the weights lifted across all the repetitions over a course of time. It is important in helping us understanding the overall intensity of a training session or a training block, especially if you are analyzing previous training data of an athlete. Now, if you want to analyze someone's old training program, check out my free program analyzer in the description box below. When it comes to analyzing different training programs or training blocks, it can help us compare the programs and compare the average intensity against its effectiveness for performance. Through comparing the average intensity between training blocks or training programs, you can see where a lifter should be kept at in terms of its average intensity by comparing training blocks or training programs. For example, in an 8-week training program, the average intensity is something that will organically go up long term across the training years, and a good visual example comes from this paper that I've referenced before, which shows the optimal average intensity that different populations should be exposed to. As you can see, untrained individuals benefit being exposed to lower intensity, but as individuals become more experienced, maximal strength gains will benefit from higher average intensities. If we ever plateau in a training phase, we can use average intensity as a metric to compare to give us a clue to whether we were exposed to excess intensity or too low of an average intensity in training. This metric is also going to be particularly useful, especially when approaching competition. This doesn't necessarily mean that average intensity needs to go up a lot, but it is important to see what works best for a peak and tapering for an individual. Like the other metrics, average intensity doesn't account for the quality of the repetitions performed. It doesn't tell us our proximity to failure that we were training at, and higher average intensity in a training block doesn't always equate to a harder training session, especially if the volume was much lower. While it gives us an insight into intensity, it doesn't provide a complete picture of the training load without considering the total volume and the frequency of workouts as well. It also cannot tell us the spread of the reps across the percentages. For example, if half of your reps were at 80% and the other half was at 70%, your average intensity at 75%. In another situation, if half of your reps were at 85% and the other half were at 65%, the average intensity will still be at 75%. Now, this is going to be a key indicator of the overall dose and the nature of training, and it should be looked at with the total repetitions too. So before I move on to the next metric, I would super appreciate it if you guys quickly click the like button, and it really helps me create better and more useful content in the future. Now, moving on to the next part, we're going to look at metrics that look at the state of performance. Now, the first one is going to be the first set RPE. So the RPE of the first set or the top set is a subjective measure of the relative intensity of the first set that you perform for a given exercise of that session. Since this is likely going to be your freshest set, by gauging your RPE, it becomes a prerequisite for estimating your top end 1 rep max for that day. So by looking at your first set RPE, it can help indicate the individual state of readiness or fatigue. As well as monitoring your top end performance, it can also indicate the individual state of readiness or fatigue as well. This is useful when comparing to the first set of the previous weeks of the same session. And tracking changes in your first set RPE over time with similar weights can show whether a lifter is able to show next. Now, tracking changes in your first set RPE over time for similar weights and exercises can show whether the lifter is able to show new levels of performance, indicating adaptations and improvements in progress. What it can't tell us is what our work capacity is likely going to be for that session. For example, let's say we perform 5 reps at 100 kilos at RP6 for the first set, and if we do another 2 more sets of the same reps and weight, our last set may be at, let's say, RP7. But for another day, we could still perform 5 reps at 100 kilos at RP6. But after 2 more sets, we may find ourselves hitting, let's say, RP8 or more in our last set. So for the second scenario, it tells us that our work capacity may be less due to being in a higher state of fatigue. If you want more information, you should definitely check out this video here about what the point is of top sets at a given RPE. So the first set RPE is valuable at helping and individualizing training programs based on the athlete's perceived effort and response. So the next metric, similar to first set RPE, it's going to be the last set RPE. Now, this is the subjective measure of the exertion of the last set for a given exercise. So this metric can offer insights into the athlete's fatigue and exertion levels towards the end of the exercise, as well as the difficulty and intensity of that training prescription. It can also allow us to figure out what percentage of a 1 rep max we were working at by the last set. It can also indicate how fatigued we were towards the end of the session. A higher last set RPE relative to the first set may suggest significant muscle fatigue, especially if there is a huge discrepancy. It can also allow us to figure out what percentage of our 1 rep max we were working at by the last set. Consequently, it can describe the nature of the dose of the training prescription. So for example, let's say give someone 5 sets of 5 at 75%. Depending on what the last set RPE is of the last set, the equivalent percentage of a 1 rep max may actually be higher. A notably higher last set RPE may or may not indicate a need for more room for recovery on adjustment in prescriptions in the subsequent weeks. Ultimately, it also depends on other factors too, particularly the outcome of the top end's performance in the subsequent sessions. One important thing to note is that having consistent rest periods is going to be important in order to make this metric more reliable. So the next metric is going to be your estimated 1 rep max or your estimated total. Now, your estimated 1 rep maxes, or E1RM, are basically your projected estimates of what your 1 rep max would be if you were to hypothetically max out. And as a derivative, you can also create an estimated total. Now, these are often based on generic or customized RPE percentage charts, such as this one. And in this chart, it basically displays what your estimated 1 rep max is based on the load that you hit. In this chart, it basically displays what your equivalent percentage is of your 1 rep max based on a certain rep and RPE that you hit for a certain weight. Obviously, these hypothetical charts will differ from person to person as well as from lift to lift. And so when it comes to these estimated 1 rep maxes, you do need to take the absolute value with a pinch of salt. And what you need to care more is about the relative motion of your estimated 1 rep max across time rather than the absolute value. And this gives you clues to your physical readiness to perform at any given point in time. You can also use this to help you estimate your projected attempts for your attempt selection when it comes to competing. So moving on to the next set of metrics, which is the peak load and peak total. Now, peak load and peak total is a good objective set of metrics to track, and it can be used in conjunction with your estimated 1 rep max as well. So your peak load and peak total is the highest weight that you have performed within a given session or within a given week or a training block. And you can combine these measurements to help you monitor your progress and also plan your attempt selections. Obviously, unless you monitor the RPE of these loads, you're not going to have an idea of what you necessarily have left in the tank. So using a peak load by itself cannot necessarily tell you whether your top end is increasing short term, but long term it can do that, which moves me on to the next one, which is personal bests or personal records. Now, personal bests, PB, or personal records, PR, refer to the highest weight of amount of weight that you have successfully lifted. So your personal bests or personal records metrics refers to the highest weight that you have lifted to date. People often track PBs of single rep sets or multi-rep sets, but you can also track your PBs with RPE performance too. For example, if you performed 200 kilos for a single rep, but it was the fastest that it's ever moved, then you can consider that an effort PB. So it's going to be a common benchmark to assess performance and improvements over time. And so if you are constantly hitting PBs in many different ways, then you know that you are going to be progressing over time. It's also a good instrument for setting specific and measurable goals for medium-term training, and it acts as a motivational factor for athletes. Progression or stagnation of your personal best can evaluate the effectiveness of a training block and indicate whether a change in the program is needed. You can also use your PBs as a benchmark for competition, so you can figure out what their attempt selection plan needs to be. Along with tracking PBs of individual sets, you can also track PBs with your working set, and this can let you know whether you are potentially due for a big PB afterwards when you recover from it. So moving on to the next set of metrics, we're going to look at metrics that indicate a state of fatigue. So when it comes to tracking fatigue, you don't really track fatigue like you track performance, but instead you track the impact that fatigue has on your performance. So here are some useful things to look at when considering monitoring fatigue. Change in RPE at a fixed load or change in load at a fixed RPE. So the first thing we can track is the change in difficulty for a fixed load or change in performance for a fixed difficulty. Assuming that we have dialed down the dose of training well for whoever the program is for, if we are progressing and then we see our RPE for a load that is getting harder or a load of a fixed RPE is dropping, we can potentially find ourselves in a state of higher fatigue where we are no longer able to recover back to baseline. Obviously, the context of the situation is going to be important because a drop in performance isn't necessarily due to fatigue, because let's say if you suddenly reduce training dose and then you see that things are appearing harder, you may be actually detraining more likely. The next metric is going to be velocity loss. So velocity loss is a measurement that's monitored if you are using a speed tracker. Now, I won't go into velocity too much because velocity deserves its own video, but essentially there are a couple of things that you could look at with regards to velocity loss. Now, you could look at how much of a velocity drop you are getting within a set, and this can indicate how much more fatigue you may be due to accumulate. The next metric could be the RPE percentage fatigue drop. Now, what this metric quantifies is the increase in perceived effort from the first set to the last set RPE of a given exercise, and it helps us identify the level of fatigue developed through the exercise session. Now, it is calculated as a percentage to quantify the difference between the RPE of the sets. Now, this metric directly measures the perceived increase in effort and fatigue during the prescription. So, a higher percentage indicates a greater interset fatigue. It can also provide insights into whether the training intensity is appropriate. Now, training intensity in this case refers to percentage of a 1 rep max. Too high of a drop may indicate excessive intensity by the last sets, whilst little to no drop may indicate that the equivalent percentage of a 1 rep max of the first and last sets are not too dissimilar, and potentially more space to be able to train more. It helps in assessing the effectiveness of the recovery between sets and exercises as well. Significant fatigue drop percentages may suggest inadequate rest times or inappropriate intensity or volume from the get-go. Ultimately, this helps in tailoring training sessions based on an individual's responses, making adjustments to the intensity or volume of the working sets as you go on. Just because there may be a high fatigue drop does not mean that the lifter should not be exposed to it. You may find yourself to be someone who needs to train to that level of difficulty for meaningful progress to happen. So the RPE percentage fatigue drop is a valuable short-term metric to monitor for understanding the subjective experience of fatigue during the prescription of an exercise. Ultimately, the RPE percentage fatigue drop is a useful metric to use within the short term. And you would use this metric to compare how you end up performing in similar movements within subsequent sessions week after week. For example, let's say you did 3 sets of 5 with the first set RPE-6 and the last set RPE-7, and the next week you did 3 sets of 5 again with the first set RPE-6 but the last set is RPE-9. You can probably tell that your recoverability has gone down. So the next set of metrics to compare is comparing tonnage against the change in estimated 1 rep max. Now, tonnage pitched against estimated 1 rep max can be a great visual comparison of the work done and the relative top-end performance of each given week. And this is a very useful comparison of metrics to see when a series of progressions within a training block is leading up to a point of overreaching where you are no longer able to recover. This may indicate the need to drop the training stimulus, i.e. know when to put in a deload week. Again, this is another metric that I would use to monitor the programming on a short-term basis, not necessarily long-term. So these are the several metrics that I think are worth tracking in the program. So some advice that I would give around monitoring is that there can be a fine line between how much monitoring is too much, because you don't necessarily want to be monitoring so much that you're not sure what's going on. It's important to remember that you don't want to be too reactive when using the metrics to help you program, as the body is a very complicated system and the deviations in stress and fatigue can influence your performance in the short term. It's also important to distinguish which metrics that you look at when comparing long-term changes in training and short-term changes in training. At the end of the day, you want to use monitoring as a tool to assist in the coaching process, not necessarily dictate the coaching and programming process. Are there any more metrics that you would consider monitoring? Are there any that you think that are not useful, that are more useful? Put them in the comments below. I'd like to see what you guys think of these metrics. Hope you guys found this useful. And as always, click like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And I'll see you guys on the next one.